Welcome to Daily Design Stories, and today we have Guy Pyrzak. He is from NASA. I'm so excited for this session today because it's like a fanboy moment for me talking to someone who has worked on the Mars operations, and I don't know how many more operations he has worked on. Right. So before I get into the session, I would like to a Guy to give a little bit of introduction about himself, and then we can get into the session.
All right. Well, thanks for having me on this podcast. I'm excited to be here. In terms of my background, I started at Carnegie Mellon University, getting a master's in MHCI back in 2000, I want to say 2005, just a while ago. And then since then, I've worked on a variety of Mars surface missions as well as manned missions. So I got to work on the Mars exploration rovers, developing a few small features for them. And then from there, I went on to work on the Phoenix lander, where I got to help with their planning software. And then I did a little bit of operational support there, but no actual operational planning roles. And then after that, I worked on the International Space Station and shuttle, developing some what's called problem reporting software, where they basically needed an update from the stuff that they built when the shuttle first took off. So it was quite old. So we got to work on software for them for that. And then after working on that for a little bit, I worked on something called the Constellation Program, which is a since canceled program to send folks to the moon.
Wow.
And then after that, I went to work on the Curiosity rover for a few years and helped them out with their planning software. And then after I was done with their software, I got the opportunity to be what's called a science planner. And that's basically a role where I got to use the software I designed. So I got to actually be the user for the first time, which was really exciting. And I got to do that role in operations for a little bit. I then left NASA and went to work at a health insurance marketplace called eHealth over in the Bay Area. And then after working there, I went to work at JPL, which is a part of NASA, but has a very special relationship to NASA. And I have been at JPL since, I want to say 2014, maybe 2015, where I've been working on the, we call it internally Mars 2020, but probably most of you guys know it as the Perseverance rover. And I've been working on that where I basically architected the ground data system, so all the software that's used on the ground, and helped JPL start using the cloud in terms of its software tools and move them to using a bunch of web-based technologies, which was fairly new for JPL in terms of its software that it uses. And that's where I've been since. I've also more recently had an operations role on Perseverance as well. So I got to be a user on that mission. And so that's always fun when you get to, as I like to say, when you design the amusement park to actually get to play in it later. So it's been fun.
That's a pretty solid introduction. Like, I don't know where to start, but okay, cool. So before we get into in depth a little bit on your operations and what you did, uh, I have a few cards. So I have few cards to play with you. So there are a few set of questions. We'll pick three cards. We won't get into all of them. Just three cards. Something it will be related to, so to know you better, more than your LinkedIn profile, but know you as a person, and some experiences you can share from that. Okay, so you can probably say stop, and I can just stop it. Okay. Where do I? Okay. Okay, wait. Good. Let me
Stop.
Okay, cool. This one. It says, whose opinions do you hold in high regard, and why do their opinions matter to you so much? One person in your life which you follow.
Sure. I would have to say my wife. It is definitely her opinion that I follow most closely and take into deep regard. One, she's my partner in everything, and two, I'm a bit of a workaholic,
Mhm.
and she has a front row seat to that. So she's often able to see and understand my state relative to how much I work or overwork, as it were. And she's been my partner for 12 years now,
Oh,
and or more. And so she's done a great job kind of keeping me balanced and making sure I try to have a sustainable lifestyle. So definitely her opinion.
amazing. Okay. Second one.
All right, stop.
Cool. When was the last time you were moved by someone's words?
When was the last time I was moved by somebody's words? Um, oh wow, I'm gonna seem like such a family man. It was probably something my eldest daughter said, and
Oh,
I don't remember exactly what it was, but my, kids, I think the saying, kids say the darndest things. And my eldest daughter is definitely of that age where she's making these, profound realizations that kids can make that make you really kind of rethink your life and what you're doing. So I would definitely have to say my daughter.
okay. Last one.
All
Last
right,
one.
stop.
So I love it when people praise me for my dash.
Mm. I love it when people uh praise me for my creative problem solving.
Oh,
I think that's kind of what uh is my favorite thing to do, and my favorite kind of quality that I bring to the table is kind of showing up and saying, what if we did it this way instead? Or what, exploring kind of the wacky out there ideas. So
okay.
that's why I got into design.
Yeah.
Exploring the design spaces is definitely what I enjoy doing, and getting to do that. So that's probably it.
Ooh, that was amazing. I think every designer, the best thing, like people praise us, is the same thing, like that problem solving or asking the right questions. So talking about your career, yeah, you said like you first joined NASA, then you went into something e-health insurance, and then you again came back to NASA. So what brought you back? What was why did you come back to NASA?
Sure, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, so I think everyone who, when you go into the design space, you have to kind of ask yourself what you're doing, and why you're going there.
Yeah.
And in terms of background that I didn't get into when we start talk about background, when I was an undergrad, I really wanted to go into the medical field.
Mm.
I was a pre-med student, and I went so far as even taking the MCAT. And so, I went and started working at NASA, and right after I was done working on the Curiosity rover, I said, oh, I'm going to go work in health stuff.
Ah,
And I think I was very naive personally in terms of what design looked like for health aspects, and what was involved in health insurance marketplaces and health insurance in general. And I think one thing that I always enjoyed and appreciated about NASA was this kind of mission that it had, that seemed very, for lack of a way of putting it, noble,
mm.
in terms of exploring our solar system, and putting mankind, humankind, further out into the solar system. It's a very noble cause, right? And we do it for all of the United States and all of America, obviously, but we also do it for the world. And I found myself missing that very deeply, right? That type of higher purpose, and saying, why am I doing all of this? Why am I working so hard and spending time away from my family? And so, as I said, my wife has been my partner and helps guide me, and I think she saw that I missed that type of higher calling and higher purpose. So I went back for that main reason, is finding that's a unique quality that you have a hard time finding anywhere that isn't really a kind of space exploration organization. There's other places that you can find it, but I was also very familiar with it at that point. So I probably could have gone to a nonprofit or something else, but
Mm.
that was the biggest thing. And it was, it's like coming home again, as it were. So
Wow. Okay. Cool. So you have worked in a different domain, then you came into space domain. So how are things like different uh, in other domains and space domain? Like if I have worked in a health domain also, so there are like teams, there are design teams, there are UI teams, there are engineering teams, but space domain has a different stakeholders altogether. So how are those?
Yeah, I think that probably the best way to think about it. So there's two aspects, right? And I learned about a lot of these different aspects actually at while I was at eHealth. You know, there's business to business companies. There's companies who sell their software to another business. There's business to consumer companies, right?
Mhm.
Stuff that sells stuff to the general public, your Apples, your Googles, all that sort of stuff. And then there's like internal software development projects,
Yeah.
which is basically built when you like work for the company to build software for the company to make the company be more effective.
Mhm.
And so when I was at eHealth, I was mostly doing business to consumer or business to business stuff, right? And then at NASA, I was mostly doing company internal software.
Okay.
And so for me, that was probably the biggest difference in terms of the organization and what you're worried about, what you're analyzing, and what you're taking into account, versus necessarily aerospace versus health. Health insurance is very complicated, very similar to the aerospace and space exploration. So in that way, they were very similar, and that's what was enticing. But really, the big difference was the difference between building software internally for a company. And I think the closest analog I can think of is like if you work at Pixar, Pixar makes movies,
Yeah.
but they also have a whole software development studio
Yeah.
that builds their own software. I think that the same thing is true for a lot of stock trading companies as well. They have internal software where the service they provide is we will make you a lot of money with your stocks. And so that is actually the difference. Is that when I work at NASA and now at JPL, most of the stuff I'm working on is internal to JPL, and most of the public will never see it or understand kind of the impact that the stuff that I do makes, versus at eHealth, it's very much public facing. That comes with pluses and minuses, and you just have to decide from the designer perspective what you're most into.
Right. So, but who are these users? Like, what are the teams that look like inside NASA or the projects? Because I understand there are different projects. There are people working on 5-year projects. There are people working on 1 month project, or different types of operations happen. So
Yeah, I mean, yeah, so our users tend to be operators of various types. If you're working at JPL, it's usually people who are either the science team who are deciding what science they want to do on some type of probe. It could also be engineers. And then when I was working on other things, it can go so far as being an astronaut, so your users can be astronauts. So those are your users, the operators, your users. And then in terms of the software development team, it just matters how big of a team it is. So when I started in my career, I was, one designer slash developer amongst a team of developers. I've also been a product manager. So managing how the product needs to develop, coming up with like what the schedule is going to be when we're going to have releases, prioritizing features, things like that. And then eventually, you can get to the point where you're managing multiple pieces of software that all have to work together in concert to achieve some larger goal. So I think in terms of organization, in terms of the software development, it's probably not too dissimilar than what you would expect from a typical software, development organization.
Yeah.
You don't have like large QA teams. That's probably the biggest difference. So, when I was at some places, they'll have, like 200 QA people for one piece of software. We don't have that like giant QA team. Some places I know have 2 or 3 designers for a single, sub part of a piece of software. We don't have that. So it's usually, a team of between 6 to 7 developers, a single designer, a single QA person, and then, I think that the saying was, ideally our software, and I think this is true everywhere, you can buy 2 pizzas and feed the whole team, assuming the whole team can eat pizzas, but that's the idea. It shouldn't be too big of a team, and most of our teams are not that big. They're usually under 10 people.
Wow. So it surprises me because there's so much at stake, right? Like, I mean, at NASA, whatever projects we do, it's so much at stake. One small calculation going wrong, it would hamper the entire operation. And you're saying there are less team members. So how does that work? Like, how do you assess
Yeah, so you get you end up with yeah, so that's a great question. And JPL especially kind of prides itself on doing this very well, which is called system engineering, right? So you basically, each of these teams is a subsystem, and you create a system of systems, and then you have people whose responsibility is, and those are generally called systems engineers, to
Mhm.
make sure that the system of systems is all working properly, and you come up with plans to test that system of systems in all the various ways you have to do it. So yeah, you have a small team, but that small team works with other teams, and it gets more and more complex as you get
Yeah.
bigger and bigger and
Yeah.
bigger. And so as you get more experience, you get asked to work on more pieces of software and working on putting them all together. So my most recent project on the Perseverance, I was in charge of making the whole ground data system work together, which is upwards of 50 or 60 pieces of individual software that all have to work together.
Yeah. Okay.
And so I have to make sure that I understand how each of those pieces of software work. Each of those teams, right? Each of the pieces of software can have a team of between 5 to 10 people. So you can see how very quickly things get complicated.
Yeah.
And there's people who have, enough experience to kind of understand how you have to test each of them and make sure they all work together.
Yeah.
That's how we do it. It's good.
I still don't understand it, but you are the man. You know how what you do. So,
I'm
uh,
happy to answer any follow-up questions. Yeah.
so who is the client here? Like, who gives you the problem statement, or this is what we have
Yeah.
to do? Because I feel space is something, it's an unexplored area where we are trying to explore something. So we probably don't have the success metric. Maybe how do we measure the success of this particular thing? I don't know if we have. I don't know from my
We
side.
do. We
Okay.
do actually have success metrics, and it's actually quite interesting. So, when any mission gets started,
Mhm.
they get these things called requirements. And those requirements come from NASA usually. So NASA, when they say, hey, we're going to do a mission, they say, here are some requirements you have to abide by.
Okay.
And so those requirements, at these like high levels, get broken down into more and more detailed level requirements. And
Wow.
those requirements tend to be the things that we have to abide by. And
Mhm.
so our clients are usually the owners of those requirements and the owners of the operational processes that are going to exist. And so those are the people that we meet with, and the success is usually based off of whether or not they are successful, right? So
Mhm.
the ground data system,
Right.
the software that we're building for the ground, is only as successful as our usually they're called operations systems engineers, the people who decide how the operations team has to work together, if they feel like the operations team is getting what they need to be successful. And sometimes those are science operations people, sometimes they're engineering operations people, but it's usually someone who says, okay, this is my vision for how, as I like to say, the
Mhm.
theme park is going to work. And so then we have to build the theme park that then the operators get to play in and explore space with.
Wow. Okay. So you also said something about design themes when you visited CMU, and so when we are saying about the playground, is it the same thing you're talking about, like creating a simulation for the operators to play and then make the final version?
Yeah, so the design simulations that we did at JPL was basically a large scale user test or a large scale, I think, experience design um, experiment that we did. It basically let us kind of, before we built all this complex software that I was talking about with these large teams, really put things together for people to get a preview of what this is going to look like before it's built. I think sometimes we like to describe it as the Hollywood version of a theme park as opposed to the actual theme park. So it looks a lot like what it might look like for real, but it's not there. It's all smoke and mirrors, as it were. And that lets us kind of explore how people are going to work together, because in general, that's what our software does, right? It helps the science team and the engineering team do their own jobs as well as work together. And when you have a mission like Perseverance, which requires upwards of 200 plus scientists and engineers to work together every day to explore Mars, you want to make sure you have your concepts both from the how people work together as well as the software that's going to enable them to do that work figured out, so you don't spend a lot of money building the wrong thing, which I think any designer can relate to. So the design sims were really a way for us to kind of say, hey, here's the idea that we have. Is this the right thing? Is it going to work? And lets us understand the software in a context of the larger operational process.
Oh, okay. So can you tell us a story, like because I really like the statement that called constraints creates creativity. So can you give us like one story where there were a lot of constraints given to you, but you came up with or you and your team came up with an innovative solution which was creative and solved the problem? Anything related to space domain?
Sure. I mean, I feel like design is the job where you take constraints
Yeah.
and solve given the multitude of constraints you're given. So there's a lot of examples of that. I think it begs the question of which type of constraint are you interested in? There's the constraint of time, there's the constraint of money, and there's the constraint of capability.
Right.
I tend to like the problem of how do we the constraint of how do we take a really slow operational process and make it faster. But that was not necessarily a constraint in terms of that was a constraint in the design space, but it didn't constrain me probably as much as I was like, it's a good question. Let's see. I'm assuming you said there were constraints on the design is what you want, not constraints on the output.
Yeah, as in any small story which you have, okay.
Yes, I do. Okay, I got one for you. So, when I was working on the Constellation program, along with the International Space Station and Space Shuttle, there was a big push to develop software to enable them to do their engineering process. And the way NASA does engineering is pretty unique to NASA. They have pretty unique requirements. And so we went out and tried to find something out there that we could just like grab and use to enable the engineering process. It was basically a trade study. And as we were doing that trade study, we really realized that there was nothing really that met the needs of our customers at all. And so someone said, really what this is kind of like a weird twist on bug tracking. And so what that led to, and I think I have a paper on this, is a really interesting experience where we said, what if we took an open source piece of software and just tweaked it a little bit, because we think we can actually make something better than what's out there right now commercially to meet our customers' needs, much faster and cheaper than kind of grabbing something off the shelf that we'd have to customize. And that's what led to a big project that I think is still actively in use at NASA, that was basically based off a bug tracker. And even to this day, I find that there are a lot of times where this idea of how do you take a problem that is unique to your organization and adapt something that's readily available quickly, so that it can meet the needs of your end users. And that was one of those situations where we had so many constraints because of how NASA does work. And in this case, it was not just NASA, it was NASA working with like hundreds of other organizations, and how do you get them all to work together? It was a very highly constrained problem space, and we couldn't find anything that really met the needs. And so the creative solution that one of my colleagues came up with was, hey, let's just grab this open source piece of software and work with them. So we actually ended up partnering with, in this case, Bugzilla, an open source piece of software, to develop this kind of customized thing that worked really, really quite well, and it's still in use today. So I think that was an interesting problem, because there were so many constraints all over the place, and it seemed almost unsolvable. And I don't think I would have never thought, go grab something from a completely different domain that does completely something different and work with them to kind of solve the problem.
NASA doing like going out and grabbing a third-party software and using it till now. It's an interesting story. But it saves a lot of time. I think
Yeah,
there are so
yeah.
many smart people out there who have already worked on similar problems and the solutions are already available. We just redo it, maybe reinvent the wheel again and again. But maybe we
Yeah,
should.
and that's probably the hardest part, right? Is realizing that you don't have to reinvent things.
Yeah.
And the other story I was going to tell was the story that on Perseverance, how we did a similar thing. But I think the International Space Station one was a bit better.
Okay. Good. So after working in the design industry, like for so many years in the space domain, in the other domains as well, how do you define design in your own words? What is design to you?
Yeah, so in my mind, design is where you take a bunch of constraints, and I really like your statement of constraint makes good design. Take a bunch of constraints and a area of understanding. I call it a domain, but it's really just an area of study or an area of work. And then a problem solving process, right? Of how do you understand that? And you kind of take these three things together, mush them together, ideally with some type of methodology that works, right? That results in good outcomes. And when you take those, ideally that's what design looks like, right?
Yeah.
You take those different things, a knowledge of a domain, an understanding of various constraints that exist, various approaches that work, put them together, and ideally that's what design looks like. And then I don't recall the quote off the top of my head, but there was a very great quote that I remember of effectively design is those three things, right? Understanding the problem, understanding the constraints, and understanding ways of solving it. And if you have those three things, you're usually a designer.
Oh, okay. I ask this question like to every experienced designer because everyone has this interesting definitions to design. It's not something which we read in the books in our college or university, but out of this 15, 20 years of experience, they define design in a very different way. And that is so much valuable and from it's from their own words and they express it in their own words, right? So getting to learn so many things from people like you, all the experienced people, right? Cool. So, what would you tell young designers excited about working in the space domain? Like, what do you think is the so? For me, I think the space domain is just getting started. Earlier, it was more just the government is controlling it. Right now, private companies are coming into it. We are talking about space exploration. Blue Origin putting people into space. Virgin Galactic has doing this space tourism thing like flights. SpaceX is doing something else. So we are just getting started, and that this domain is getting bigger and bigger, right? So for young designers, what would you tell them? Like what I also want to know, like what could be the job titles? Like there are UX designer, we know that, but when this space domain opens up more as designers, what could
Yeah.
be the profiles?
So the interesting thing about the design space and aerospace in general is it is not a software first organization.
Yeah.
And that is to say, when you go to organizations like this, they tend to not think about the software. And the easiest example I can think of is like the automobile industry, right? Those guys for the longest time didn't ever think about software running their cars, but most cars are computers with wheels and a steering wheel, right? Like they're mostly computers or robots if you really want to get fancy. And aerospace is very similar in that way, that like a lot of aerospace folks don't think about the software or the operations team primarily. When you talk to them, eventually, well, of course I need software to do my job, but they don't necessarily think about the software first. They think about how it's going to be used. So I think that's an important thing for folks in that area to really realize that it's being a software designer for aerospace is very much like being a designer for either like for any company that's building something that's going to go inside of their products, right? No one ever is going to go to JPL and be like, we want to use JPL because they make great operations software or SpaceX for that matter, right? SpaceX isn't going to do that either. So you have to kind of realize that your software brings value by improving the overall mission, right? By making that value by adding value to the overall organization, that the software is not the goal in of itself. And that most people won't actively recognize or think about that organization as a software organization the same way most people wouldn't think of Pixar as a software organization, even though it is. Like if you look at Pixar, the reason why they make great movies is because they have amazing software developers who enable them to tell their stories the way they want to. And so if you think about it that way, and that's enticing to you, that's what you want, and that you want your software to enable a larger kind of story, then that's really all you got to think about. And then from there, in terms of what job titles are you going to look for? I said it a few times, but it's usually ground software, ground data system, and then sometimes they like to say software systems engineer is a favorite title. If you're lucky, you'll find a place that says I want a designer, but that's a bit harder. Usually they don't realize they want a designer. Human factors is another thing that often comes up as a topic of like, I need a software human factors person. And again, that's because human factors is a big thing in aerospace. But then when you go, well, what human factors are you worried about? They're like, oh, the software human factors. And you're like, okay, so you want a software designer. They're like, what's that? So those are all terms that if you're looking to do, that would be the type of roles I would look for in terms of all that sort of stuff. And realize that, I think really at any company, the designer doesn't just get to sit and think about color schemes or fonts to use. You probably have to do more than that. You have to understand more about the domain and the organization than just having someone show up and say, here's how you build the software, tell me what the color scheme should be. It's very much, hey, we have this problem, we think software can solve it, this guy has a cool algorithm, how do we make it go? And so it's very much that type of design job where you have to usually take some innovative software or algorithm that someone's built to solve a problem that someone has in aerospace and make them kind of mush together in a way that makes sense to a third party who is an operator who kind of probably definitely doesn't care about the algorithm. They could care less as long as the algorithm works. And oftentimes doesn't want to know every detail about the thing that you have to design for. They just want to be able to get whatever's in their head into the software so this other thing goes.
So when you say software systems engineer, but does he work like a designer, or we have to like, because when I hear the word engineer, like, do I have to code or something, or like what's
that's a good question. Yeah, so a systems engineer does not necessarily have to code. In fact, you can get a degree in system engineering by itself. And usually systems engineers are responsible for understanding the various parts of the system and how they integrate together and their interfaces and how they work.
Okay.
So that's what a systems engineer generally does. And oftentimes the systems engineer is for understanding the requirements, understanding the parts of the system, how they interact with each other, and then how you later on make sure that these parts that come together meet the requirements that were written. We generally call that verification and validation. That's what a system engineer does. So none of that is like coding. Now, why do I say software system engineer equals designer? Well, what do designers tend to do? We say, well, there's a person, which is a system in this worldview, that has requirements against it, and people do have requirements against them, right? They have to do work so fast, or they have to get something done or understand something. So they do get requirements. People get requirements in this that they have to fulfill. We have another system, which is software, that it has requirements.
Right.
And they have to work together, this human system and the software system. They both have requirements, and they both have to work together to meet requirements. And now I've suddenly just described, and you have constraints in that environment. You can't do whatever you want.
Yeah.
And so suddenly design becomes a way of solving the software system and the ground software system engineering problem, because it's people and software coming together to solve a problem. And so in that way you don't. In other ways, and more similar to just having a small organization, oftentimes you will be on a team where there's not enough design work, where you have to kind of provide some other role. And sometimes that other role can be a software developer, but at the same time, that other role can be managing the product timeline, or it could be doing QA. I mean, that's another thing. You make the design, and then once the design is built, you test the design to make sure the design works the way you expect it to. So there are lots of roles, but oftentimes, yeah, you usually have another value proposition you have to provide to a team. Not always, though. Sometimes you can get away with just being a designer and just doing design work the whole time.
So how do we get that? So if if I want to get into the space domain, do I look for job roles as a software system engineer kind of a roles? Because other
Yeah, I
roles.
mean, I would first and foremost look, go to your Blue Origins and your SpaceX's and your NASA's and your JPLs, and you can look for designer jobs. So just like type in designer, and you will actually find, you could probably even type in user interface designer, and you might find a few jobs. So I don't want to make it seem like you have to search for, software systems engineer.
Right.
But assuming you don't find something you're looking for, then what you could do is say, okay, another thing you could search for is software systems engineer, or ground software systems engineer,
Okay.
and you'll find jobs that will oftentimes come up there. But you might be surprised, especially both at NASA JPL, I believe SpaceX, because I've met those folks. I know SpaceX has designers who are dedicated to building the displays that the astronauts use. You can also do search for human factors specialist, human factors researcher, human factors analyst.
Okay.
Those could all be terms that I could see coming up in terms of the job, and those could all just be effectively user interface designer jobs.
For a designer, this portfolio is very important, right? So how do we prepare our portfolios for these type of jobs? Because in a college environment, we won't get any problem related to space to work on. So how do we show our thought process, or what is something that people look into in a portfolio when they're applying for such job?
So I usually, when I look at jobs, I look for portfolios that have what I would call complex data problems that have to be analyzed. By far, that's the hardest part for a lot of our work is, you can't, it's not it's not information that most of the population is familiar with. It's not the same as how do you write an email? How do you buy something off of Amazon? It's much more complex. So I would look for stuff where people have taken a very complex domain that requires really a strong understanding of that, and ideally demonstrate how they created something that works for both an advanced user and a novice user. Because that's the other big part of this is we have both types of operators on our teams. We have people who are, just showing up for the day and doing really basic type of work, basic relative to NASA. And then we have people who, developed the system from scratch and wrote their PhD thesis on some of these concepts and want access to all the guts of the underlying thing. And the joke that I tend to have with folks is we have to build like the iPhone and the Linux kernel at the same time, right? Like this kind of two very different types of devices, and finding the right middle ground where you can give the operator access to what they need to do to get their job done and not making it overwhelming, but at the same time make really complex question asking possible, because sometimes you will need that, and even if it's just 1% of the time, you can't punt on it. You need to get that 1% still needs to be available to folks, even if it's not necessarily intuitive.
Is it okay to have like a longer portfolio piece, or it's recommended to have like shorter one?
I think every person I've ever talked to has said make it short. And from my perspective, I mean, I think I once told somebody, assume you get 5 minutes for someone to look at your portfolio. And I mentioned that to a colleague, and they're like, 5, that was really generous. They're lucky if they get 2. So, I mean, I think that's the thing is, when everybody gets a lot of applications, and there's not a lot of time. And most of us, I can see really quickly what type of work the person does and what type of work they're interested in and what type of work they want to. So that's the biggest thing. Your portfolio should reflect the type of work, not only that you have done, but the type of work you want to do.
Okay.
And if your portfolio is like, here's all the stuff I did, I don't actually want to do any of that. Well, that's not a very good portfolio. Your portfolio should highlight the work you've done that reflects the work you want to do.
Right. Right. It's a tough, it's a very tricky situation, because now, because I'm a student, I'm preparing my portfolio, I can understand, like, although, so sometimes we get so attached to the research and the methods we have used, that we have put so much time, and then during the portfolio we have to remove this. Oh, I can't put this because it's getting too long, but I want to put
Mhm.
this, but I can't. It's that struggle and the fight with our own selves every day, kind
Yeah,
of.
I usually tell people have it. I mean, you can always, there's some people who like they want to it matters what you want to show, right? For my domain, I want someone who I would rather see someone show me a few really complex things that they did that shows that they're able to take a really complex thing they're not familiar with and break it down into consumable bytes that can then be executed on. There's somebody else who might just want to see, show me, the 50 best icons you've ever made. It just matters what you're looking for and what type of designer you're looking for. It turns out that for me, at least, the type of designer I tend to look for is someone who can take something that even the engineers can't fully wrap their heads around and can take this really complex thing and break it down into something that's bite-sized and consumable, and then executable by usually someone who knows nothing about that domain, right? Because a lot of times our software developers are not aerospace engineers. They are usually people who got their degree in computer science and are showing up and understand a bunch of complex algorithms, but they don't know necessarily how to apply those to aerospace. And the aerospace folks understand what they have to do to get their job done, but that's the divide that oftentimes the designer has to kind of be able to jump back and forth between.
Thank you so much. Oh, this was amazing, Guy.
Sure.
Uh, I have been excited about this space domain for a very long time. Like I came to the US just for this thing. Okay, I have to get into this space where it's amazing. Like if I show you something, like my entire room is filled with stuff like this. This is the newest poster I bought. This this, this is by Aaron
Yeah.
Raplin. He's a very famous artist, and I met him in Adobe Max, and I said, okay, I have to buy this from him, and I got it signed. And my entire
There
room
you
is
go.
somewhat like that. There are all stars on the top, and it's fascinating. As a kid, also from when I was in school, there was always this question like, what's there out, what's out there, uh, and I don't know any of the other domains which, other than engineering or being an astronaut, what are the other spaces that could actually get me explore these spaces. So it's luckily I got into design, and I think it's something I can contribute to, something I can do in this space which can create an impact in the space area and space exploration. Anyways, thank you so much, Guy. I was very excited to talk to you. Do you have
Happy to do it.
any final words for us?
Yeah, if you're interested in doing design work at JPL, we are actively looking to hire folks in all sorts of areas. And you can go to, I believe it's jobs.jpl.nasa.gov to apply for to look for all those jobs I was talking about if you're interested in.
Yes.
In general, the aerospace industry is definitely looking to hire folks. So it's a big field. It's ever expanding, and if you're interested in it, feel free to jump in. I think they could use your help.